Okay, so this video is just going to provide some background, some context to kind of set the stage for modern macroeconomic theory. And so you will recall that in our first unit we spent a lot of time talking about markets, about supply and demand. And so everything that we talked about up to about the late 19th, early 20th century is really what economics was all about. And we refer to the people that studied economics during this time as the classical economists. So this is the classical school of thought. And they did a really good job of understanding how individual markets worked. And they were able to extend that analysis to see how a change in one market might lead to a change in another market. So, for example, a change in the market for lumber might lead to a change in the market for houses because you need lumber to make the house. Now, the classical economists recognized that sometimes markets would fall into disequilibrium. So something would cause the market to kind of go off track. But the buyers and sellers in the market, households and firms, all acting in their own rational self-interest, would adapt to changes in the market, and eventually the market would settle at a new equilibrium. And so we might start at one equilibrium price and quantity, maybe a problem arises, everybody responds, and eventually we settle at a new market price and market quantity. And generally speaking, the classical economists looked at three different types of markets. There's the market for products, for goods and services, and so that's a lot of what we looked at during the first unit. But then there's two other markets. There's the market for resources in general, but in particular, the market for labor, because obviously most people are going to be earning income from selling their labor. But we could also look at land and capital markets. But then there's also a third type of market, financial markets, or financial capital markets, money markets. And so they might see a change in a product market lead to a change in a resource market, lead to a change in the capital market, the finance market, and back and forth. But eventually these markets would sort themselves out. And the role for government was basically non-existent. There really wasn't any argument to be made for a government to be stepping in to become involved in markets, because markets would simply sort themselves out. And so, for the most part, that theory does a really good job. Classical economic theory does a really good job of explaining what we observe in markets and industries. However, in the 1920s and 1930s, something happened that was unlike anything we'd ever seen before. Now, classical economists recognized that at times, things in general were pretty good. Sometimes they weren't so great. Business is good, business is bad. They started to get this idea that there is this kind of back and forth, this business cycle, what we today call the business cycle. But up until the 1920s and 1930s, there really wasn't ever too much concern. I mean, even when times seemed particularly bad, classical economic theory said it'll sort itself out until the Great Depression. And the Great Depression was different for two reasons. The first reason is that we saw problems in some markets, which was nothing new. Classical economists said sometimes there will be problems, but it didn't confine itself to just one or a handful of markets. So what may have started in particular industries, for example, the stock market, right, financial markets in 1929, very soon spread to basically every market out there. So all of the product markets, all of the labor and resource markets, and all the financial markets. And so we say that the economy, the country was experiencing not just market failure at a micro level, we were now experiencing market failure at a macro level. So the market failure became widespread. So that's the first big thing that we noticed was different, was that it was widespread market failure. The other thing that we ran into during the Great Depression is that once markets failed and once it became widespread, the economy didn't sort itself out. Classical economic theory said you just, government is hands off, laissez-faire, let the market do its thing. Eventually it'll return back to equilibrium, but that was simply not the case during the Great Depression. And so we say that in addition to the market failure being widespread, we said it was very persistent, meaning it just did not sort itself out. So at this point, we've got classical economic theory that does a really good job of explaining some things, but is now unable to explain what's going on in the Great Depression. It can't explain why we're experiencing widespread and persistent market failure. And because it's persisting, and classical economics says, okay, we'll just let the market sort itself out, well, obviously, the classical economic theory isn't going to be of much comfort to people when they're unemployed and all the markets are in failure. So when you've got reality and theory that are butting heads, something's got to give. And so eventually we start to realize that, okay, well, reality is doing something we've never seen before. And so we just need to think of a new way to explain what's going on and then to figure out what to do about it. So in other words, we need to develop new theories. And so this is where a man named Keynes comes in. Now, he was an economist in England, so he was a classically trained economist. But he recognized that classical economic theory just wasn't doing enough to explain what was going on. And so he sat down and realized, well, we need to reconceptualize this. We need to be able to wrap our brains around the big picture. And so this is the beginnings of what we call macroeconomics, and this is where we started to measure things like output and national unemployment and the national price level. So these are some of the variables that came out of this new theory that we've already discussed in Unit 2. And so, following in Keynes's footsteps, he's sitting down, he's looking at what's going on, and he clearly sees, it's bad across the board. And on top of looking at the aggregate, the big picture, he's going to try to figure out, well, where does he want to focus first? Which part of the economy does he want to zero in on to try to start explaining what's going on? And the decision that he felt he faced was, well, do I look at the supply side of the economy, right, the firms that are out there making goods and services, or do I look at the demand side, which is, people, households, consumers buying goods and services? And so, if you think about it, imagine that I'm a firm and I open my doors one day and I announce to everybody and I say, hey, I'm willing to sell widgets, right? I've made a widget, I've got a price, and I want to sell these widgets. Well, there may be people out there that hear me say that, oh, he wants to sell a widget, but is that necessarily going to give them an incentive to buy a widget? Is that going to induce them or encourage them to buy a widget? Some people may not know what a widget is. Others may know what a widget is and just decide they don't need or want a widget. And so me willing to sell does not necessarily guarantee that there will be someone else willing to buy. All right? It doesn't create an incentive. Now let's turn it around. Let's say that I'm a consumer and I wake up one day and I announce to the world, hey world, I want a gizmo. I don't know how to make it, I don't know where to get one, but I'm willing to pay for a gizmo. Now once I express that willingness to pay, suddenly that creates an incentive for somebody else to say, hey, there's somebody that's willing to pay me money if I can figure out what a gizmo is and make it. And so that willingness to pay, when I express a demand for the gizmo, that's then going to create an incentive for somebody else to figure out how to produce a gizmo in order to sell it. And so following this kind of thought exercise, Keynes decided it was best to focus on the demand side of the economy. And so when he looks at the Great Depression and he sees widespread and persistent market failure, that suggests to him that the root cause of the Great Depression was insufficient demand. Whether it was households or firms or governments or foreigners, somebody somewhere was not demanding enough goods and services. They weren't spending as much money as would be necessary to prevent the Great Depression. So he's going to focus on the demand side of the economy. And this is where we pick up where we left off previously. We've already talked about the demand side of the economy in the form of expenditures. So when we first defined GDP, we said there were two approaches to measuring it. And the first was this expenditures approach. We calculate and we add up all the dollars that households, firms, governments, and foreigners are spending on goods and services. So in class the other day, we started talking about the first expenditure, consumption, and we identified its primary determinant as income. And so we did all the math and analyzed the relationship between income and consumption. But there's a few other things that cause consumption to rise and fall that are going to allow households to spend more or spend less. And so briefly, those are wealth, expectations, debt, household debt, and taxes, personal income taxes. So wealth, we think of wealth as money, and we distinguish wealth from income by saying that income is the money you earn from working, from supplying your labor, which means wealth is money that you get from any other source. So it could be you have, property that is worth something. You could sell your house, sell your land. You have jewelry, you have stocks, bonds, other assets. Maybe you inherit money from a relative. You win the lottery. These are all other sources or forms of wealth. And so if you think about it, if a person suddenly has an increase in wealth, that's going to allow them to go out and spend more money. And alternatively, if they see a decrease in their wealth, well, that's going to prevent them from spending as much money. So generally speaking, wealth is related to consumption in a positive fashion. So just like income, more wealth, more consumption, and vice versa. Expectations, that's something we talked about at the micro level on the demand side of a market. And the same concept applies here. So when consumers and households feel more positive about the future, that will mean they will probably go out and spend more money. So if a household is feeling good about job prospects or income in the future, maybe they'll go out and they'll buy a new dryer that they've been putting off for a while, or they'll buy a new car or a new house. But if their expectations become negative or pessimistic, well, then they're going to be a little bit more cautious with their money. And so rather than going out and buying a lot of stuff, maybe they'll start to save their money, and so their consumption decreases. So expectations, generally speaking, have a positive relationship with consumption. Now, the other two determinants, debt and taxes, they actually have negative relationships or inverse relationships. So as households accumulate more debt, so as they borrow more money, as they put more money on the credit card, what that's going to mean is that in the future, they're going to have less money to engage in consumption. Because if you think about it, on the one hand, you're going to be exhausting what we call your credits. Like a credit card, there's a credit limit on it. It says this credit card, you can go out and spend up to $5,000. Well, the more money you put on the credit card, well, the less credit you have. And maybe you ask for a credit line increase. You ask the bank, say, hey, can you raise my credit line? And they may be willing to at first. But as, again, you continue to accumulate more debt, you're going to run out of the credit that's available. And the person that's extending you the credit may not be as willing to extend you any more credit. So as you exhaust your credit, you can't spend as much because you've been accumulating too much debt. Now, the other thing to consider with debt is that the more debt you accumulate, well, the more money you're going to have to pay back in the future. And so every month as you accumulate more debt is going to lead to higher and higher debt payments. So as you keep using that credit card every month and piling up the credit card bills, you're going to have to keep using more of your disposable income to pay off the credit card, which is going to be money that you aren't using to spend on anything else. So as household debt increases, we see consumption decrease and vice versa. So those are inversely related. And then personal income taxes are also going to be inversely related with consumption. So we talked about how income is either spent or saved by households, but we ignored taxes. And so now we've got to factor taxes in and think, well, we earn income, but before we can even spend or save any of it, the taxes are already taken out. So when we talk about income being spent or saved, what we're actually talking about is what we call disposable income. So if you take your total income and you subtract the taxes that you pay, whatever's left over is your disposable income, and then that's what you can use to spend and save your money. So obviously, if personal income taxes go up, that means households have less disposable income, which means less consumption, and vice versa. So those are our determinants of consumption. And again, remember, consumption is the largest form of expenditure. And so if we're following Keynes's approach, looking at the demand side of the economy, and we see something like the Great Depression, well, a pretty good starting point or a pretty good guess would be that something has caused households to stop spending money, or at least to start spending less than they were spending before. And so those determinants, again, income, wealth, and expectations, those are all positively correlated or related to consumption, and then household debt and personal income taxes, which are inversely related. Now that leaves the other three forms of expenditures, and you'll recall that those are investment spending, government spending, and net exports. Investment spending, remember, that's spending by firms in an effort to expand their productive capacity. So I may have a widget factory, and if I want to start making more widgets, I may need to go out and buy other goods and services from other companies. So maybe I need to get some more equipment or tools, or maybe I need gizmos to make my widgets. And so the primary determinant of investment spending, we're going to associate that with the interest rates. So if you think about it, a firm that wants to grow its business may need to borrow money to go out and buy the things it needs. Well, how much money are you going to borrow today? Well, it's going to depend on what the interest rate is. So if interest rates are relatively high, well, that means the cost of borrowing is high. And so firms may not be as willing to go out and borrow money to then spend on goods and services to grow their business. On the other hand, if interest rates are relatively low, that makes it cheaper to borrow. And so firms may go out, borrow larger sums of money, and then spend that money to grow their business. The other determinants of investment spending, there's the rate of return. So the rate of return is how much additional money you would expect to earn after you grow your business, produce your product, and sell it. So you may borrow money today and pay interest, right, for the money you borrow, but then hopefully you're going to produce more of your product, you're going to earn a lot more revenue, and then once you subtract the costs, the borrowing from your revenue, whatever's left over is profit, and that's your rate of return. So if firms think that the rate of return is going to rise in the future, that means if you spend money today, you'll make even more money in the future, well then they'll go out and start spending money today to grow their business. On the other hand, if the rate of return is expected to fall, that means, well, you may spend money today, but you won't earn as much in the future. That may inhibit firms from spending too much today. So those are going to be positively rated, rate of return and investment spending. The others, expectations. So firms, if they have positive expectations about the future, they think the future is looking good for business, well then they may start investing today so that they can expand their productive capacity in the future. On the other hand, if they think, ooh, maybe business is going to not be so great in the future, well then they certainly aren't going to go out and spend a lot of money to expand their factory and then not have enough customers to purchase the products. Technology is another determinant because again, if you're a firm and you want to be as productive as possible, you may need to invest in new technology. And so as new technology is developed, firms invest in that technology. So they go out and spend more money to acquire that technology. And then of course if there's a loss of technology, we wouldn't necessarily see a total decrease in investment spending, but obviously if there's no new technology out there, then firms aren't going to have anything to invest in. Now the last two are inversely related with investment spending. So capital goods on hand is the first one. And remember that capital goods, that's the stuff that helps us make other stuff. So that's the tools, machinery, the equipment. And to say that we have capital goods on hand simply means that we have capital goods, we have equipment and machinery that's just laying around. It's ready to be used, it's not currently being used. And so if firms have a lot of capital goods on hand and they want to start producing more of their product, well they don't need to go out and buy more of that stuff, more of that equipment. They've got it, it's sitting there, it's ready to go. They just have to flip a switch and start using that equipment. But as they start to use up that capital goods on hand, right, as there's less and less available machinery and equipment sitting around, eventually they're going to run out. You're using all of your capital already. And at that point, if you want to start producing more, well now you're going to have to go out and spend more money to acquire more of those goods and services, that equipment, the tools, machinery. And so that translates into higher investment spending as capital goods on hand decrease. And then the final one, operating costs. And this is just the money that it takes to just keep the lights on, to keep your workers showing up, to keep your suppliers delivering your supplies. It's just the daily cost of running your business. Well, if you think about it, if your daily costs go up, if your electric rates go up or your workers demand higher wages, that means that it's going to take a little bit more money just to keep the business running at the current level of production. That means there's going to be less money left over at the end of the day that you can then use to reinvest in your company and expand. On the other hand, if you can find a way to decrease operating costs, that saves you money at the end of the day, and then you can take that money you save and reinvest it in your company. So again, determinants of investment spending, we've got interest rates, that's inversely related. We've got the rate of return, expectations at technology, those are all positively related to investment spending, and then capital goods on hand and operating costs are both inversely related. Now the next form of expenditure is real simple. It's just government spending. And we're going to come back and talk about this some more next week. But this is just the spending by all levels of government. So the federal government, state governments, city governments. And we're not going to discuss any determinants right now. We're just going to assume that Congress and the President, the governor and the legislature, the city council and the mayor, they, through their political process, just choose some level of government spending. So we're not going to have any determinants and say this is up and that's down. We're just going to say that the government officials, the elected officials, they set that number. And that's all we'll say about it for now, but we'll come back to it later. And that leaves net exports, which is our final form of expenditure. And so this is when we consider international trade. We take into account that we are exporting goods to other countries, right? That's foreigners purchasing our goods and services. But at the same time that we're exporting, we're also importing. We're purchasing some of their goods and services. And so we take our total exports, we subtract the total imports, and whatever's left over is what we call net exports. And the three determinants that we'll focus on for now, first off, are domestic and foreign income. So you think about it, if our income goes up, we're going to buy more of our goods and services, but that might also cause us to buy more foreign goods and services. And so we would see a change in net exports if our income goes up or down. On the other hand, if foreigners, right, people in other countries, if they experience a change in their income, well, that means they may buy more or less of their own goods and services, but they'll also buy more or less of our goods and services. So our exports may change as a result of a change in foreign income. And the last thing to consider when we're talking about international trade is exchange rates, because obviously we're talking about, how do we use our dollars to try and purchase goods and services from Europe, where they use the euro, or from China, where they use the yuan. So we've got to take into consideration that, if I want to purchase something from another country, I first got to convert my currency into that country's currency. And so we're not going to get into the mechanics of that for now. We may have time to come back to that at the very end of the semester. But for now, just recognize that exchange rates could possibly play a big role in determining the level of net exports. And so that covers the major forms of expenditures. And there's a whole graphical model that we're not going to go into for now. We're just going to focus on those components of the model, those four expenditures: consumption, investment spending, government spending, and net exports. And the question is, well, what causes any one of those forms of expenditures to go up or down? And so each of those has the determinants that we've discussed. And then as a result of one of those determinants changing, so for example, if household wealth increases, that translates into a change in consumption. And then we're right back to asking, well, what happens to the overall economy? What happens to GDP when that consumption goes up, for example?